Joe Biden is not just bad on COVID. He's also just terrible on the economy, right? There's a reason his approval ratings are at 33%, according to Quinnipiac. I cannot get over that stat. That stat is astonishing. Inflation has now hit its hottest rate since 1982. Since 1982. According to the Wall Street Journal, U.S. inflation at its fastest pace in nearly 4 decades last year, as pandemic-related supply and demand imbalances, along with stimulus intended to shore up the economy, pushed prices up at a 7% annualized rate. The Labor Department said Wednesday the Consumer Price Index rose 7% in December from the same month a year earlier, up from 6.8% in November. The so-called Core Price Index, which excludes food and energy, climbed 5.5% in December from a year earlier, which was a bigger increase than November's 4.9% rise, the highest rate since 1991. This is because we blew an enormous amount of money into the system in 2020, and then Joe Biden decided we need more of that in 2021. And it was a disaster area. This sort of inflation, by the way, is brutalizing workers. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Biden-Powell price increases reduced real wages by 2.4% in 2021. So you got a pay cut in 2021. According to the Wall Street Journal, it's important to understand what a policy and intellectual failure this inflation represents for Keynesians who are in charge of current economic policy. The Biden administration and Federal Reserve flooded the economy with money in 2021, even as the recovery from the COVID recession was over. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell became a cheerleader for the $1.9 trillion March spending spree on top of about $4 trillion in COVID relief Congress spent in 2020. The central bank also declined to withdraw its extraordinary monetary support despite clear signs of incipient inflation. When critics began to warn of excess monetary growth and price increases, the sages at the Fed and White House dismissed it as transitory. That failure is reminiscent of the 70s, when Keynesians also ran the economy, but had no explanation for the inflation that took off or for the stagflation that later set in as that awful decade rolled on. They blamed corporations, they rolled out whip inflation now buttons, and imposed price controls. Only at the end of the decade, after inflation became a political liability for Democrats, did Jimmy Carter appoint Paul Volcker to the Fed. Joe Biden remains in denial. He said today's report, which shows a meaningful reduction in headline inflation over last month, with gas prices and food prices falling, demonstrates we are making progress in slowing the rate of price increases. But actually, core prices without food and energy increased from the pace of the previous month. And this entire price is being paid by people who are in the middle class. If you're rich, you can afford this. If you're in the middle class or if you're in the lower class in terms of earning, you cannot afford it. You just cannot. And by the way, the supply chain crisis continues to marinate and percolate. Pete Buttigieg, a potential presidential candidate thanks to the fact that he's gay, the Secretary of Transportation who's presided over the largest supply chain crisis of my lifetime and went missing for 2 months to be on paternity leave when no one had suffered any sort of physical trauma at all, because, of course, he and his husband adopted a child. Pete Buttigieg, he says that the supply chain problems are going to continue. This guy wants to run for president.
What we know is as long as there is a pandemic, it will be creating disruptions. Now, the good news is we've found a lot of steps that we can take, including in the short term, that have made a huge difference. But if we have to bring in so many goods from overseas that a shipping issue or a factory closure thousands of miles away stops us from getting what we need, that's a problem.
Oh, well, yeah, it's all about what's happening overseas. By the way, producer prices skyrocketed 10% in December. That's the biggest gain ever recorded, according to Fox Business. The producer price index surged 9.7% in December from the year ago period. It's just incredible. But all of this contributes to the fact that the Democrats are in serious, serious trouble. According to the Center for Politics, Larry Sabato at the University of Virginia, he is no Republican. Larry Sabato points out that this is going to be a massive year for Republicans. He says that the Republicans could be picking up tons and tons of seats. He says in 2020, the Republicans won 213 seats, just 5 seats shy of a majority. Republicans are starting this cycle with roughly 35 more seats than they held in advance of 1994 and 2010. And Democrats are not very overextended, at least based on the 2020 presidential results. They only won 7 seats Trump carried for president. However, the potential exists for Republicans to have a blockbuster 2022 election, according to Sabato. When assessing the GOP potential in 2022, they think the number they have in mind is 35. That would give Republicans a 248 House seat majority, eclipsing their 247-seat victory in 2014 as the largest Republican House majority since the Great Depression. They think that this is quite plausible. Democrats are in serious trouble, and they can whistle past the graveyard by suggesting their opponents are racist. It's just not going to work. The battle for the culture is heating up. We here at the Daily Wire are making some big moves. So be sure to like, subscribe, ring that bell, because you're not going to want to miss a single moment.